I didn't know a wrong door could change a life like this, but it did. I was just trying to get through a job interview in downtown Seattle, telling myself today would be the day everything finally started to make sense. The building was too quiet, too polished, like even my footsteps didn't belong inside it. I remember holding my resume so tightly my fingers went numb, waiting for my name to be called. But instead of a normal office hallway, I found myself walking toward a door that had no label, no sound, just a strange heaviness behind it. I told myself it must be storage or maintenance, something I wasn't supposed to see. Still, something in my chest tightened as I reached for the handle. The moment I opened it, the atmosphere changed in a way I couldn't explain. Inside, there were people in dark suits, calm voices, and an unexpected silence that made me stop breathing for a second. And then I saw him. He wasn't loud or dramatic, just still, like the room bent slightly around him without permission. His attention lifted slowly, and for reasons I didn't understand, it landed directly on me. I should have left, I know that now, but my body didn't listen. Instead, I stood there holding my breath, while the world seemed to narrow into that single moment. Because in that instant I understood something was about to change, even if I didn't yet know how. I wasn't prepared for what happened next, not the way his expression shifted, not the way the room felt suddenly colder, not the way every sound seemed to fade into the background. Someone near him spoke quietly, but I couldn't hear the words anymore. Only the pressure of the moment building like a wave I couldn't step away from. My name wasn't called, but I felt as if it had been pulled into something I was never meant to enter. And when he finally stood, everything in me told me to run, even though my feet refused to move. That was the moment I realized I had already crossed a line I couldn't see, and there was no easy way back. Weeks of planning, interviews, and careful hope suddenly felt meaningless, as if the door I opened had chosen my future for me instead of the other way around. I did not move at first because the moment he stood up felt like the air itself had changed pressure, like the room was no longer designed for someone like me to exist inside it. My mind kept trying to return to the job interview I was supposed to be having, to the normal life I thought I was stepping into just minutes before. But nothing about this place felt normal anymore. The man I saw in the center of the room began walking toward me with slow, controlled steps, and every person in his path simply made space without being asked. No one raised their voice. No one questioned him. It was not fear in the obvious sense, but something quieter, like understanding that resistance was unnecessary. I should have turned and left right then, but I was still holding on to the idea that this was a misunderstanding, that I had simply opened the wrong door in the wrong building and could still find my way back to the world I knew. When he finally stopped a few feet away from me, I noticed how calm his expression was, almost unreadable, like he had already decided something about me without needing my permission. He looked at my hands for a brief moment, then back to my face and spoke in a voice that was even and precise, asking why I was in that room. I tried to explain, my words coming out uneven, that I was here for a job interview, that someone from Human Resources had sent me to this floor, that it was a mistake. But as I spoke, I could feel how out of place I sounded, like my explanation belonged to another world entirely. He listened without interrupting, which somehow made it worse, because there was no reaction to guide me, no sign of confusion or reassurance, just silence. Then he finally said that this was not the kind of place where people arrived by accident, and that statement alone made my stomach tighten. A man in a dark suit stepped closer behind him, speaking quietly in a language I did not understand, and I realized I was no longer being ignored. I was being assessed. The man in front of me, Kenji Takahashi, as someone finally addressed him, turned slightly as if considering something I could not hear, then looked back at me with the same steady calm. He did not raise his voice when he said I should come with them, but it was not a request either. My heart began to race as I followed a few steps behind, my mind still trying to convince itself that this was part of the interview process, some strange corporate procedure I did not understand. The hallway we entered was quieter than anything I had ever experienced, lined with doors that looked identical and unmarked, like they were designed to erase meaning. I noticed how no one else spoke directly to me, how every glance was brief and deliberate, as if my presence was temporary but not irrelevant. When we finally stopped in front of a closed office door, he opened it for me without looking away for long, and I stepped inside expecting answers, but finding only more questions reflected back at me in the stillness of the room. And when he followed me in, closing the door softly behind him, I realized this was no longer about a job interview at all, even if I still did not understand what it had become. I stood inside the room without moving because the silence felt too precise, too controlled, as if even my breathing was being measured in ways I could not see. The office was minimal, almost too clean, with a large desk positioned near a wide window that showed the city below like it belonged to another life entirely. Kenji Takahashi did not sit down immediately. Instead, he remained near the door for a moment, as if making sure I understood I was not being held by force but by circumstance I had already stepped into myself. That thought made my chest tighten even more. I finally spoke again, my voice smaller than I intended, repeating that I was only here for a job interview, that there had been a mistake, that I was supposed to meet human resources on another floor. He listened carefully, then walked slowly toward the desk, placing one hand on its surface as if grounding himself in the space before responding. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost conversational, but every word felt deliberate, like it had been chosen long before I arrived. He told me there was no human resources interview scheduled on this floor, no open position that required anyone to be sent through that hallway. My stomach dropped at those words because it meant I had not been misdirected by accident. It meant something else had brought me here, or someone had. I took a small step back without realizing it, and he noticed immediately, his gaze lifting to meet mine again with quiet focus. For a moment neither of us spoke. The air felt heavier, not threatening in a direct way, but shaped by something I could not interpret. Then he asked me my name again, even though I had already given it earlier in the hallway. I answered Aaliyah Johnson, and the way he repeated it afterward made it sound like he was testing the weight of it in his memory. He then asked what I saw before entering the room, and I hesitated, unsure if there was a correct answer. I told him I saw people, discussions, nothing I understood, and that I did not mean to interrupt anything. He nodded slightly, as if confirming something only he needed to confirm. After that, he walked to the window and looked out for a few seconds before speaking again, saying that people who accidentally entered certain doors usually left immediately, and the fact that I had not made me different from the others who made similar mistakes. I did not know whether that was supposed to comfort me or concern me more. I tried again to explain that I only wanted to leave and return to the lobby, but when I turned toward the door, I realized it was no longer something I felt certain I could simply walk back through. It had not locked, yet it felt distant, as if the path I took to get here no longer aligned with where I currently stood. When I looked back at him, he was watching me with the same controlled calm, and then he said something that made everything inside me pause. He said that I had already been seen by people who did not forget faces easily, and that leaving without understanding what had happened might not be as simple as walking away. There was no threat in his voice, only certainty, and that certainty made my thoughts spiral faster than anything else. I asked him what he meant, my voice barely steady, and for the first time, his expression softened slightly, not into kindness but into something more complex, like reluctant consideration. He told me that I had stepped into a world that operated by different rules, and that whether I realized it or not, I was now part of a situation that had already begun before I opened the door. I stood there trying to process his words, feeling the weight of them settle into something I could not yet name, while outside the window the city kept moving as if nothing had changed at all. I remember standing there longer than I should have, trying to make sense of words that felt too large for the room I was in. Kenji Takahashi did not move closer, but he also did not create distance, and that balance somehow made it harder for me to think clearly. The city outside the window continued its normal rhythm, cars moving like nothing unusual had happened, while inside that office I felt completely separated from everything familiar. I asked him again, more quietly this time, what he meant by being seen, and he took a moment before answering, as if deciding how much truth I was allowed to hear. He told me that certain environments in this building were not meant for public access, not because of secrecy alone, but because of the kind of attention they attracted. He explained it in a calm way, almost like describing workplace policy, but the meaning behind it made my hands feel cold. I told him I did not want trouble, that I only came here for a job, that I could simply leave and forget all of this, but when I said the word leave, he looked at me in a way that made me stop speaking mid-sentence. Not because he was angry, but because he seemed certain that I was missing something obvious. He walked back toward the desk and pressed a small button on an intercom system I had not noticed before. A moment later, the door opened and another man in a dark suit entered without hesitation. He spoke briefly to Kenji in a low voice, then glanced at me once before stepping aside. I felt my pulse increase, not because of direct threat, but because of how naturally they communicated, as if my presence had already been integrated into their situation without my agreement. Kenji finally turned back to me and said I would not be able to leave immediately, not because I was being detained, but because leaving now would create confusion that I was not equipped to handle. I asked him what kind of confusion, and he answered that there were people who had already registered my presence in a space I was not supposed to enter, and that walking away too quickly could draw attention I did not understand. I tried to focus on practical things instead of the weight behind his words, asking if this was about the interview, about a misunderstanding with the company, but he simply shook his head slightly and said it was not related to any normal employment process. That was the moment I realized my assumptions had been completely wrong from the beginning. The man who entered earlier returned and placed a simple folder on the desk, but no one asked me to approach it. Instead, Kenji gestured for me to sit, not as an order, but as a controlled suggestion that left little room for refusal. I sat down slowly, still unsure if I was making the right choice, and as I did, I noticed how the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, as if my decision had changed the direction of the moment. Kenji remained standing while the other man left the room quietly, closing the door behind him without sound. Then Kenji finally spoke again, saying that if I truly wanted to understand why I was here, I needed to accept that nothing about this situation had started with that door, and nothing would end simply because I wished it to. I looked at him, trying to find certainty in his expression, but instead I saw only calm awareness, as if he had already accepted outcomes I could not yet imagine. And in that silence, I began to realize that leaving was no longer just a decision, but a question I had not been prepared to answer. I sat there longer than I meant to, not because I was agreeing with anything, but because my mind was still trying to catch up with the idea that none of this was what I thought it was. The folder on the desk remained untouched, as if it belonged to a version of reality I had not been granted access to yet. Kenji Takahashi stood near the window again, watching the city in silence, and for the first time I noticed how completely he controlled stillness, as if even waiting was something he did with intention. I asked him what I was supposed to do now, my voice quieter than before, and he turned slightly without rushing, as if the question itself had already been expected. He said I was not required to decide anything immediately, but that remaining where I was currently placed was the safest option until certain unknown variables were clarified. The way he spoke made it sound less like control and more like structure, but I still felt the weight of not being free to simply walk out. I told him I had no connection to anything dangerous, that I had only come for a job opportunity, that I was just a normal person trying to build a stable life in a new city. When I said those words, he finally looked directly at me again, and there was something in his expression that made me pause. Not disbelief, but something closer to recognition of how far removed my understanding of this situation was from his. He walked back toward the desk and finally opened the folder, flipping through its contents slowly without urgency. I could not see what was inside, but the way his eyes moved told me it was not casual paperwork. After a few moments, he closed it again and said my arrival had already been noted by multiple departments within the organization, not as an applicant, but as an unexpected variable. I did not understand what that meant, and I told him so, but he only replied that understanding would come later, once I stopped trying to interpret everything through normal expectations. That sentence unsettled me more than anything else he had said so far, because it suggested there was an entire structure of rules I had never been informed about. I stood up slowly, asking again if I could simply leave, and this time he did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the door and opened it, but did not step aside. The hallway outside looked exactly the same as before, yet somehow it felt different, like distance itself had changed. He told me I was not being prevented from leaving, but that leaving without context could place me in a position I would not be prepared to navigate alone. I asked him why he was telling me this, why he was even involved, and for the first time there was a pause in his certainty. He said it was because certain decisions, once triggered, did not remain isolated, and my presence had already intersected with something larger than a single interview process. I felt my chest tighten as I looked between him and the open door, realizing that freedom and safety were no longer the same thing in this place. The silence between us stretched until it felt heavier than words, and I understood that whatever choice I made next would not simply determine whether I stayed or left, but whether I entered a version of reality I could no longer unknow. And for the first time since I arrived, I was no longer sure which option was more dangerous. I stood near the open doorway longer than I intended, because something about the air beyond it felt unfamiliar in a way I could not explain. It was the same hallway I had seen before, the same clean lighting, the same quiet structure, but my perception of it had changed completely in only a short amount of time. Kenji Takahashi did not rush me. He remained where he was, slightly behind me now, giving me space that somehow did not feel like freedom. I asked him again if I could leave, this time more directly, trying to anchor myself in something simple and understandable. He answered calmly, saying that I could walk out at any time, but that the consequences of doing so without context were something I would have to carry alone. That word, consequences, lingered in my thoughts longer than anything else he had said. I stepped closer to the doorway, my hand lightly touching the frame, trying to convince myself that this was still just a misunderstanding, just an unusual corporate environment that I had accidentally walked into. But before I could take another step, I heard movement behind me, and another man entered the room without knocking. He held the same controlled posture as the others, but his attention went briefly toward Kenji before landing on me. He said a few quiet words I did not fully understand, then placed a second folder on the desk, different from the first. Kenji turned slightly, acknowledging him without speaking, then motioned for the man to leave, which he did immediately and without hesitation. The room returned to silence, but it felt different now, more structured, like something had shifted into a new phase without my permission. Kenji finally looked at me again and asked me to step away from the door for a moment. I hesitated, but I did as he said, moving back toward the center of the room. He walked over to the desk and opened the second folder, this time sliding it slightly toward me, though not close enough for me to reach without fully committing to it. He said nothing at first, letting me see only fragments of information, names, references, and structured notes that did not resemble any standard employment documents I had ever seen. I asked him what I was looking at, and he replied that it was an assessment of the situation created by my presence in the wrong part of the building at the wrong time. He explained that in organizations like his, timing and location often carried meaning that outsiders did not immediately recognize. I told him again that I did not belong in any of this, that I was only here because I followed instructions given to me by someone at the front desk, but even as I said it, I could hear how fragile my explanation sounded. Kenji listened without interrupting, then closed the folder gently and said that regardless of intention, patterns had already formed around my arrival. That statement made my chest tighten again, because it suggested that my presence had already been interpreted in ways I did not understand. I turned slightly toward the door once more, and this time he did not stop me verbally, but instead said something quieter, telling me that if I left now, I would likely continue forward without ever realizing what I had stepped into, and that ignorance was not always protection. I froze at that because for the first time he was not speaking like someone explaining a situation but like someone describing a boundary I could not yet see. The silence that followed was heavy but not hostile, and I found myself caught between two decisions that no longer felt equal. One was simple, familiar, and immediate, while the other was uncertain, structured, and far beyond anything I had prepared for. And as I stood there between the doorway and the center of the room, I began to understand that this moment was not asking me whether I wanted to stay or leave, but whether I was willing to accept that my life had already shifted into something that could not be reversed by simply walking away. I stayed where I was not because I felt safe, but because I could no longer tell what moving would actually solve. The doorway behind me still existed, still open, still leading back to the world I understood, yet it no longer felt like a simple exit. Kenji Takahashi stood near the desk, watching me with the same controlled patience as before, as if he had already seen this exact moment unfold many times with other people. I asked him again, almost in a whisper now, what would happen if I simply walked out. There was a pause before he answered, longer than any of his previous responses, and in that pause I felt the weight of uncertainty settle deeper into my thoughts. He told me that I would likely leave without immediate consequence, but that I would also leave without understanding what had already been set in motion around me. He said it in a way that did not sound like a warning, but like an observation of cause and effect that I was not yet equipped to interpret. I looked at him carefully, searching for any sign that this was some kind of manipulation or corporate intimidation tactic, but his expression remained steady, almost neutral, as if he had no emotional investment in whether I stayed or left. That made it harder, not easier, to dismiss what he was saying. I took a slow breath and asked him directly why this was happening to me, why a simple job interview had turned into something that felt like a controlled environment I was being slowly introduced into. He stepped away from the desk slightly and said that sometimes people enter systems without realizing the boundaries that define them, and once that happens, the system does not immediately reset simply because intent was innocent. I told him again that I had no connection to anything outside of a job application, that I was just trying to start over in a new city, and as I said it, I noticed how small my words felt compared to the structure of the room around me. He listened without interruption, then finally said that innocence and impact were not always connected in the way people assumed, and that my presence had already been recorded in multiple internal observations that I was not aware of. I asked him what kind of observations, but he did not answer directly. Instead, he walked back to the desk and placed both folders side by side, aligning them carefully as if preparing a sequence rather than documents. Then he said something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore. He said that there were individuals within his organization who interpreted timing, access, and proximity as indicators of significance, and that my arrival had already triggered attention from more than one of those individuals. I felt my hands grow slightly cold as I tried to understand what he meant, because I had never intended to trigger anything at all. I told him that I did not want any attention, that I did not want to be involved in anything beyond a normal job opportunity, and for the first time his expression shifted slightly, not into disagreement, but into something that looked like acknowledgement of a limitation in my perspective. He said that wanting distance did not always prevent connection once certain lines had been crossed unintentionally. The room felt quieter after that, even though nothing had physically changed. I looked again toward the door, and for the first time it did not feel like an exit or a barrier, but like a question I could not answer without consequences I did not yet understand. And in that silence I realized that the choice in front of me was no longer about curiosity or fear, but about whether I was ready to accept that some doors, once opened, do not lead back to where they began. I remained seated because standing no longer felt like it would change anything. The room was still the same, the desk still in front of me, the doorway still open behind me, yet every option now carried a weight I could not ignore. Kenji Takahashi had not moved for several seconds, and in that silence I realized he was waiting, not for an answer he could predict, but for a decision he would not interfere with. I asked him again more slowly what would actually happen if I left right now, and this time his response was different. He said that nothing would physically stop me, but that leaving would mean stepping away from a situation already in motion, and that I would be doing it without any understanding of what forces were already aware of my presence. I felt my throat tighten at the way he said it, calm and precise, without pressure or urgency. I told him I did not belong in any situation involving unknown forces or attention I never asked for, and for a moment he simply observed me, as if measuring how deeply I believed my own words. Then he walked back toward the desk and closed one of the folders, placing his hand on it lightly as if concluding a thought rather than a conversation. He said that belonging was not always a matter of choice at the moment of entry, but often a matter of recognition after the fact. I did not fully understand what he meant, but the way he said it made my certainty weaken. I stood up slowly, moving toward the door again, and this time he did not speak immediately. Instead he followed a few steps behind me, not blocking me, not guiding me, simply observing. When I reached the doorway I stopped again because stepping through felt different now, like crossing a line that would not be visible once I passed it. I turned back toward him and asked him why he was still explaining anything to me at all if I was truly just an outsider. He paused, then said something that stayed with me longer than anything else so far. He said that sometimes people who enter the wrong space are not mistakes but signals, and that signals are never ignored by systems that know how to read them. I felt a strange silence settle in my chest as I tried to process that idea, because it made my presence feel less accidental than I had been trying to believe. I looked at the hallway again, then back at him and realized I was no longer thinking about finding a job or returning to a normal interview process. Instead, I was trying to understand whether my life had already been quietly redirected without my permission. Kenji did not move closer, but his voice softened slightly as he said that I did not have to understand everything immediately, only decide whether I was willing to leave without answers or stay long enough to see what those answers might be. The door remained open, unchanged, but it no longer felt like a simple exit. It felt like a threshold that required acknowledgement, and for the first time since I arrived, I understood that whatever I chose next would not simply affect the moment I was in, but everything that came after it. I stood at the threshold longer than I thought I would, because the idea of choosing suddenly felt heavier than any decision I had ever made before. Behind me was a hallway that represented everything familiar, everything I had planned for my life just hours earlier when I walked into this building thinking I was only attending a job interview. In front of me was Kenji Takahashi, still calm, still observant, waiting without pressure as if time itself was not something he needed to rush. I could feel my heartbeat in a way that made every second feel stretched, like the moment itself was refusing to move forward until I acknowledged it properly. I asked him one final time, my voice quieter now, almost uncertain, if walking through that door meant I would never be able to return to the life I came from. He did not answer immediately, and that silence told me more than his earlier explanations. When he finally spoke, he said that returning was always possible in a physical sense, but not in the same way because understanding changes perception, and perception changes decisions that cannot be reversed. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to hold on to the version of myself that had entered this building with a resume in my hand and simple expectations for my future. But that version felt distant now, like it belonged to someone I could no longer fully reach. When I opened my eyes again, I looked at the hallway one more time, noticing how ordinary it still appeared despite everything I now associated with it. Then I looked back at Kenji, searching for something in his expression that could simplify the choice in front of me, but he remained steady, neither urging me nor stopping me. I asked him what he would do if he were in my position, and for the first time his answer was not immediate. He said that he would consider what kind of unknown he was more willing to live with, the unknown behind him or the unknown in front of him. That statement stayed with me longer than anything else he had said, because it reframed everything into something I could not simplify anymore. I realized then that I was not choosing between safety and danger in the way I originally thought, but between certainty and possibility. I took a slow step backward, then another, moving away from the doorway and back into the room. Kenji did not react, but I noticed a subtle shift in his attention, as if he understood the direction of my movement without needing confirmation. I sat down again, not because I had fully decided, but because standing at the threshold was no longer something I could sustain without breaking under the weight of it. He walked back toward the desk and closed both folders gently, as if acknowledging that the immediate moment had changed shape. I asked him what happens next, and this time my voice was steadier than before. He said that nothing would be forced, but that I would be given time to observe and understand before any further decisions were required from me. I did not fully understand what that meant, but I no longer felt like I was being pushed out of the room. Instead, I felt like I had stepped into a space where leaving or staying both carried meaning I had not yet uncovered. I looked toward the window, where the city continued moving as if nothing in my life had shifted at all, and I realized that the world outside had not changed, but I had. And as I sat there in that quiet office, I understood that whatever came next would not begin with the choice I had already made, but with the realization that my life had already started to move in a direction I could no longer ignore. And sometimes the moments that change our lives arrive when we least expect them. Maybe that's the lesson behind this story. Power can protect, love can heal, and even the most broken hearts can find their way home. If this story touched you in any way, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear which moment stayed with you the longest. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next cinematic journey filled with destiny, sacrifice, redemption, and unforgettable love. Until next time, take care of your heart, and never underestimate the power of one unexpected encounter.